We are now live streaming, Your Worship, so over to you.
Right, can you hear me now? Right,
Loud and clear.
Welcome to the 2022-23 Annual Plan Workshop number 2. Mark, take it away.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Good afternoon, everybody. So just for the benefit of any members of the public that have just joined us, what the plan is today is we'll run this workshop for just under half an hour as a council meeting. We'll then adjourn the public workshop, and a council meeting needs to continue from 3 o'clock onwards. And when that council meeting has finished, then the annual plan public workshop will then reconvene, and we will finish that workshop with councillors and elected members when it finishes. Just in terms of procedure today, so you do have a copy of the presentation in LG Hub. We certainly took your feedback from the last meeting. It was quite difficult navigating between the slides when we share the screen. So for the next half an hour, myself and Ian will take you through the presentation. It'll probably be on the screen. But when we get to the second part of the presentation, where we look at the reflections, which is the feedback that we've received from yourselves, either since Christmas or since last workshop, we'll be going through that. We won't have the presentation on the screen, so you'll be able to see me and yourselves. And if necessary, what we'll need to do is we'll just need to go through each page, and we'll be asking you to give us a clear steer by way of the voting buttons as to whether you want something in or out. So just as a reminder, this isn't official voting. This is just giving council officers a steer as to what, if any, further changes you want to make to the draft budget. This presentation is, as the Mayor has just said, it's the second workshop as we work towards the 2022-23 annual plan. So it's very much been built on what we've already presented to you. We have been making some adjustments to our Capex, and our overall average rates increase is now sitting at 7.5%. Ian will probably spend the next 25 minutes just taking you through that for the benefit of anyone who's just joined us and hasn't been part of the workshops prior to that. Ian will take you through the slides as to how we've got to 7.5%. That's probably where I think we might stop. If we're very lucky, if we get through that really fast, then I think what will probably be a good idea is to quickly run through the reflections slides, and then we'll stop. And then we'll go back to the reflection slides and we'll get your comments on those. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Ian.
Ian frozen. Oh, no.
I think whilst Ian's unmuting, Fiona, could you load up the slides for us, please?
Okay, I think I'm unmuted. Thanks, Mark, and good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, if we can get the slides set up, please.
You should be seeing them now.
Yeah, thank you. So to the next slide, please. Okay, so the purpose of today's discussion, this picks up from the workshop that we had on the 10th of February, 2 weeks ago. So we're going to just step through the changes that we've made from a budget perspective, then move into the reflections section and confirm and agree the next steps. Next slide, please. So since the last workshop, the main change, or actually the only change that we've made to the financials, sorry, back a slide, please, is around the Capex program. So we've gone through and revised the position for this year, because what happens this year is most relevant to the in terms of the rates impact for next year, because this year's Capex drives depreciation and interest next year. So the position that was included in the 10th of February workshop was a Capex program of 55 million. we've revised that down to 51.6, and there's a couple of slides later on that I'll just step through a little bit more detail on that. But that has the effect of reducing both depreciation and interest costs together by about 0.2. And that's the reason that the headline rates increase that's being proposed is reduced from 7.7, as Mark mentioned, to 7.5 in this slide set. We've also had a look at the growth assumption. So we had assumed 1.1% growth as at the previous workshop. We still think that's probably a reasonable estimate. We've got visibility. We know there's a lot of growth in the pipeline over the next 3 or 4 years, sort of 12% or more that we have visibility of. This is subdivisions that are in varying stages of concept or development, but the question is how many of those will complete through to title being issued before this June in order for them to come into the rating base and share in the in funding the rates burden for next year. And we still think around about 1.1% is a reasonable assumption. Both of those items, the Capex forecast and the growth assumption, we would still intend coming back in the final stages before adopting the plan and just revisiting them again to make sure they're as accurate as they can be before we finalise the annual plan. And then the last area is, of course, adding the further information around the elected member reflections. Next slide, please. So this graph, you'll be familiar with the format of it. Steps from, it just shows the rates increase per the LTP on the left-hand side, which estimated at 8%, and the key drivers behind that, which working from the bottom up is depreciation and interest, closing the unfunded depreciation gap, some allowance for inflation, and then other costs. So that was the LTP. The 10th of Feb workshop in the middle, 7.7, shows how those costs have moved, and then through to today's 7.5%. And again, as I did last time, I think I'll talk through the following diagram, which I think gives you greater visibility of actually what's moving behind those numbers. Actually, I should just note before we go off this slide, apologies, there's ones we picked up last night, a slight rounding difference in the right-hand bar. Basically the interest cost, I think in the version that you've got in LG Hub, shows as 0%. It's actually rounding, should be 0.1, and there's a similar adjustment in the following graph, but my team spotted the difference. If you got your calculator out, the numbers didn't actually add through on the LG Hub version, so apologies for that, just minor rounding. Next slide, please. So this diagram works us from the LTP position, 8%, and then just steps us through the key changes that have been made. And with the exception of that change to the Capex, all of these numbers are consistent with what you saw at the last workshop. I'll just whip through them reasonably promptly, just to refresh you on what they are. So we start with, from the left, the 8%. We have a slight reduction in the rates increase by virtue of growth. So what that's about is the LTP assumed a 1% increase in rating base. We're currently assuming 1.1, which means the total budget is spread across slightly more ratepayers. So that has the effect of reducing the average increase. The next two items, depreciation and interest, are driven by that Capex spend that I've been talking about. So lower Capex than initially planned this year will result in lower costs in next year, and in effect, a reducing effect on the rates increase. The next two items are personnel related. So the remuneration increases of 1.6%. So the LTP assumed a 1.5% remuneration increase in each of this year and next year. What's actually happened, we're under a lot of pressure around staffing, recruitment and retention. The current year's remuneration increases have been completed, and they came in closer to 4% than the 1.5%, and that has a flow-through impact because that's a permanent increase in cost. And then on top of that, we're proposing to increase next year's allowance from 1.5% to 3%, so an additional 1.5% remuneration increase. So those two things together amount to what you see there, which is the equivalent of a 1.6% increase on rates. The next item going the other way is a saving, the vacancy savings. So next year's LTP budget had no allowance for vacancy savings. i.e. it costed our staff establishment at 100%, as if everybody was there all the time. That's of course not how it works, and so we've introduced a vacancy factor that equates to a turnover rate of about 15% and 3 months to replace from the point where a person leaves. You go through the advertising, recruitment process, notice periods, etc. It works out on average to something like 3 months, and so when that multiplies out, it totals around about 1.7% of saving, which we have reduced the personnel budget by that amount to allow for that. The next two items are water related to the water reforms. So firstly, unfunded depreciation. The LTP assumed, so we've currently got in this year an unfunded depreciation gap of 2.5 million. The LTP assumed that we would reduce that by $1 million to 1.5 in next year, and the reason for that was to avoid accumulating debt into the long term. With the announcement of the reforms 2 years from now, we think it's a valid option to hold the gap where it currently is, and so remove that additional $1 million cost from next year. Then there's the water account surplus. So we run a closed water account, which basically tracks the revenues and costs of providing water, and we've done that since meters were introduced. As at June 2021, there was a surplus on that account, an accumulated surplus that had built up over time of just over $1.1 million, and we're proposing, again, in light of the reforms, we're proposing that we can validly release $1 million of that back to current ratepayers. So that's, again, $1 million equivalent to 1.3% of rates. And then the final item is the additional cost pressures for council, which is basically resourcing bids that we believe are necessary for us to continue to provide sustainable services and deal with the growth and demand pressures that we're experiencing. And so that lot, when added through, gets to the 7.5% increase that we're proposing today. Next slide, please. This is just a couple of slides drilling into the Capex movements a little bit more. So at the headline level, that shows the LTP Capex assumptions, which was 73 million this year, 79, 72 across the 3 years. And now what we've done in terms of changing that. So the estimated change line, those are specific project by project changes that we've made. And I'll take you through a little more detail on that in a moment. Then you'll see as you go down the table, there's another line down below, unallocated changes. And you can see we've got approximately $10 million in year 2 where we're reducing the Capex program further. What that's about is we're saying, okay, year 2, whilst the specific, we've got a project by project listing totaling 79.9 million in 22-23, we actually think from a deliverability point of view that will be, we don't think that's realistic. So we've brought it down to 70 in year 2, which is the figure we're using from a rating point of view. So the only reason we're making that adjustment is to avoid overrating or setting an unrealistic Capex base for overrating. But the main spend that, as I say, drives next year is what happens this year. So we're currently estimating 51.6 relative to the initial $73 million LTP budget. Next slide, please. And so this gives you some visibility of where those movements have come from. And you'll see in year 1, we've just noted the major projects that contribute, but essentially it's rephasing of those projects where we're reducing budgets across all of those projects, your 21.9 million, and they've been rephased into out years, so next year and beyond. And if you look at the 2022-23, the central column, you can see there the net movements that affect that year. And there's probably three key numbers there, 3 large numbers. The first one sort of just after halfway, just below halfway, Aotearoa Park Stage 2. So I just note that's the only project where there's additional money beyond what was included in the LTP. Everything else is phasing. So that project includes in year 2 4.6 million, as noted in the footnote, which is a placeholder pending council. So there'll be that's to do with the construction of changing rooms at Aotearoa Park, and that'll be subject to a council paper and decision in due course. So it won't be proceeding until there's actually a decision around it. The other two large numbers, I guess, on the table as you come down, you can see the east-west connectors towards the bottom. A 15, basically that's been rephased. Timing delays around the business case approval process, etc. I mean, we think that's going to happen later than assumed in the LTP. The only other thing to note there is there are discussions still going on with the landowner at the moment. So it's around potentially purchasing the land a little earlier. So it's possible that may change in coming months, but for now we've rephased it out. And what was the other? Yeah, the other significant movement was the Waikanae treatment plant, which again is just rephasing from this year to next year. So it gives you a bit of visibility around what's actually happening at the project level. Next slide, please. Well, that's actually the end. That's the end of the financial piece. Sorry, just take us back then, Fiona. I guess at that point, just pause really and take questions. Any questions you may have.
Councillor Compton.
Thank you. Through the chair. So if I'm sort of following this correctly, in theory, if we kept rates up at around 7.7, 7.8, we could have something like 3.4 million, 5 million to invest in other capital projects like bringing forward shared pathways or cycleways or that sort of thing?
Well, yeah, I mean, 1% of rates is about 770,000. So the thing with Capex, the calculations need to be done because Capex spreads over a long period of time. So, you know, $1 million of Capex today translates into depreciation and interest over time. So
it depends on what the actual specific thing you're putting that Capex into.
Yeah.
Cool. No, that's helpful to know. Thank you.
Councillor Randall.
Yeah, my question just relates to the McLean Park upgrades. Now, we already discussed that last week and agreed, right, on those works to be carried out. What's this 0.6 being carried forward to 223 to 224?
Sean's not with us, I don't think, but that will be a movement. There will still be sufficient money in the budget for McLean Park to deliver what was talked about last week.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, that's right. And it was supposed to start in this coming financial year, right? From July in the second year 2 of the long-term plan.
Yeah.
So that's still on track, right?
Yeah, I'm just looking at the revised Capex program. So this table we're looking at here shows movements. And then underneath that, I'm just looking at the revised program that results. And McLean Park's in there for about 1.3 million, 1.3 million from next year.
Yeah, but for the year starting from July, right?
Yeah. Okay, right, thank you. So what's the 0.6? I don't understand. Well, what that's saying is it's taken 0.6 out of this year, so we would have had budget in there for this year that's not going to happen, so we're pushing that forward. Okay, right, thank you.
You done?
Yeah, thank you.
Councillor Pavano.
Thank you for this presentation through Mr. Mayor. I'm just looking at the numbers for the Waikanae Library upgrade. Now, we've just very recently had a briefing on that as well, and there was no indication of any changes to the budget on that.
Yeah, so again, this is just phasing. I'm looking at what's actually in there for next year. So there is still $2 million in there for next year for that project. So it's purely phasing around what was allowed this year and realigning that to the delivery that's actually occurring. But there is,
sorry.
yeah, so there's a $2 million budget there for next year for that.
But what you're saying is there's quite a lot less work being occurring than that was planned.
Not necessarily. It's probably, I'm sorry, I don't know the specific details, but it's probably just recognising the reality of the timing and the fact that money will be required next year rather than this.
Okay.
Yep, thank you.
Okay. Doesn't seem to be any more questions here.
So, Mr. Mayor, in that case, I'm just looking at my watch. It's 5 to 3, and I know that you want to reconvene the council meeting at 3 p.m. So it's probably actually a good place for us to close down the workshop.
Yep. And then we'll come back to it.
And come back to it once you finish the council meeting. Yes.
Yep. Okay. Right. Let's do that.